right. I'm so excited right now. I'm going to let this wonderful man tell you something about himself. He's been here before, and I love him to pieces. Our own Terry McBride talking about the mystical history of the science of mind. Terry, please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I want you to know what an honor it is for me to stand in your presence. What you've created here at this center is quite amazing. Every Sunday I'm somewhere speaking at a Science of Mind center or Unity center. And even though I've been here before, when I got off the freeway yesterday after I flew in, drove down, went to the hotel, and then drove here to make sure I knew how to get here. And then I was just going to pull in. Just pull in. Okay, good, I know where it is. But as I pulled in, part of me just said no. So I just shut the car off, I got out, and just walked around. You know you can feel your presence outside of this building? Anyway, I want to congratulate you on what you've created here. How many of you have not heard me speak before? Raise your hand. Good. How many of you have heard me speak? How many of you don't care? What I want you to know is if I was talking to you one-on-one, first thing I'd do is find out what books have you read? What trainings have you taken? What words and concepts are you familiar with as we explore this idea of being God in form? And then we could do this whole thing based on the words you're familiar with, the concepts you're used to using. But since I'm up here and I'm going to take about a half an hour, there's a chance I might say something a little different than you're used to. Might quote scripture different, tell a story different. And all I would ask is if we run into a place where there's a little difference, please look past it. Because I guarantee you my sole intention this morning is to remind each of us how absolutely magnificent we are right now. Now with that, when there's this many people who haven't heard me before, I want to tell a little of my story, how I got into this philosophy we call science of mind, what I call the practical application of the teachings of Jesus. When I was 23, I had a spinal fusion. Hurt my back, was working construction in the summer between college quarters. During surgery on that spinal fusion, my spine got infected with the E. coli bacteria. E. coli is a bad bug. A year later, after 4 surgeries to get rid of the infection, I was referred to my doctor said, look, you need more. Every time he went in, it had spread. So he said, you need more than one just primary care physician. He said, so I've referred you to the University of Washington Medical Center in Seattle. That's where I lived. He said, they got a teaching hospital there with all the experts you need under one roof. So I showed up there and became a real celebrity. Turned out I had the worst case of osteomyelitis of the spine they'd ever seen. Anyway, my doctor became this visiting professor from England. It's a great story. He's supposed to be the number 3 orthopedic surgeon in the world. The other professors didn't talk like that, but the interns and residents did. Standoffish guy. And he said, look, with E. coli, there's not a good antibiotic. I need to find out where this is in your body, and I'm just going to go in and cut it out. It's called a debridement. Okay. So he said, I don't want to be blindsided, so I'm going to do some tests. I want to find out the extent of this infection. Okay. You know, I don't know how you were with doctors when you were young, but okay. So they did tests. For 2 weeks, they did tests. 14 days, all day, every day. They poked me in places I didn't even know I had places. Finally, they got some good x-rays, and he said, I'm going to have a meeting tomorrow with some other specialists, and when we're done, we'll come in and tell you what we're going to do. So that afternoon, my wife and my 2-year-old daughter, we sat and waited for them to have their meeting. 5 o'clock came and went, and nobody showed up, which surprised me because my doctors were all professors. Usually professors go home at 5. 6 o'clock came, went, 7 o'clock. Asked the nurse, where are they? She said they're still in their meeting. 8:15, the door to my private room opened up, and in walked 6 surgeons. 6. And if it's good news, there's usually one person to tell you. Anyway, this is what they said. This infection is no longer just in your spine. It is spread up and down your spine. It's throughout your pelvic area. It's throughout your abdomen. It's followed both your sciatic nerves into your thighs, and we believe the E. coli is just eating holes in the lower end of your colon. And if we don't stop this now, it'll kill you. The doctors don't say that kind of thing. What they say is, it has now become life-threatening. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, if we don't stop it now, it'll kill you. So he said, tomorrow what we're going to do is the most extensive debridement we've ever attempted. We're going to take you down to the operating theater, and first the general surgeons are going to start from the front. They're going to start as low as they can go down here in your pelvic area, come up around your belly button, and we're going to go up your sternum, almost your sternum. We're going to open all that up, cut out all the infected tissue, and when we get onto the spine, we'll separate your organs out of the way, and when we get onto the spine, the orthopedic surgeons will chisel and scrape the infection out of your spine. When we're done with that, we're going to roll you over, and the orthopedic surgeons are going to start from the back. They're going to start as low as they can go down here in your buttocks. We're going to come up mid-back, open all that up, cut out all the infected tissue, chisel and scrape the infection out of your spine. They went into a lot more detail than I'm giving you. He said, when we're done with that, 2 teams of surgeons are going to start at your belt line and open up both your buttocks and follow your sciatic nerves into your thighs. And when we're done with that, we're going to tip you up on the end and come in from the bottom. That one got my attention. And I say it with humor now. There was no humor then. He got about 5 minutes into it, and I just started shaking. My wife came over and held me on one side, and the head nurse came over and held me on the other side. And while they held me, I just laid in bed and watched him speak. Finally, he sat down on a chair and reached out and took my hand. And that's when I knew I was in trouble, because this guy was not a touchy-feely doctor. And he said, son, I know how radical this must seem, but we have to do this. When we're done with the surgery, the antibiotics and the drains, we're pretty sure we can stop the infection from spreading anymore. The bad news is we can guarantee you are going to lose the use of your left leg through nerve damage. And then he just looked at me. And I just looked at him. And he just looked at me. And I just looked at him. And finally, I figured it must be my turn to say something. And I heard come out of my own mouth, that's okay. I gave him permission to do a surgery where I would lose the use of my left leg. I said, that's okay. If we've got to do it, let's get this over with. But even as I heard those words come out of my mouth, I thought, what's happened to me? What has happened that in just 1 year, I would so willingly give up the use of my leg? And then he reached up and clamped my hand between his, and he said, son, we have to do this. The bad news is if it's as extensive as we think it is, there's a good chance you're going to lose some of the mobility of your right leg. You're probably going to lose the control of your bowels and your bladder. And there's a very good chance you're going to end up sexually impotent. I was 24. When they left, the resident who had been with me for the 2 weeks of tests sat on my bed with my wife, and they just held me. They didn't say anything. They just held me. And when I finally calmed down, he said, Terry, we don't know what's going to happen. We've never seen anything like this. But what we do know is you cannot expect to come out of this one whole. The name of my book is The Hell I Can't. I did not know whether I could win. but I did know when I had to fight. I could go on and tell you things they did to my body. Next morning, when they opened up the pelvic area, they found the lower end of my colon was just perforated. They said there weren't any holes in it. It was like a sieve. So they pulled my bowels out and clipped them, sewed them to my abdomen, and said, you're going to go to the bathroom in a plastic bag the rest of your life. It's called a colostomy. A year later, they did that big surgery. I was on the table for 13 and a half hours, took 27 units of blood. And the reason they stopped after 13 and a half hours is I was dying. I had 27 major surgical procedures on my spine and abdomen over 11 years. I had that infection for 11 years. I have letters from some of the finest doctors in the world to the insurance company saying what Terry McBride has is not curable. He will be left with significant permanent disability. This year I'm going to be 69 years old. I don't have a bad back. I'm not recovering from a bad back. I haven't learned to live within my human limitations, and I took the prayer they gave me that said I needed to accept the things I could not change, and I put it in the trash and put one up that said all things are possible if only I believe. And I don't have a colostomy anymore because I healed my body. I know that's a little pushy. Sometimes people come up and say, don't you mean God healed your body? I look them right in the eye and smile and say, no, I don't mean that. You see, my God didn't make me sick. My God didn't make me well. My God simply communicated, I adore you just the way that you are. And you pick the game, and I will play with you there. My intention this morning is not to challenge your beliefs. Of course, your beliefs are true. You can prove your beliefs are true. You got groups you hang out with that all believe like you. You got books you read that support your belief systems. And most importantly, you can prove your beliefs are true because that's how your life works. I'm not here to challenge your beliefs. What I'm here to do is remind you that you are powerful beyond measure and your beliefs create your reality, and you have the right and the authority to change your beliefs. You see, the greatest thing about my healing is not that I got well. Well, that's probably the greatest thing for me. The greatest thing for those I teach is in the beginning I did not believe I could ever be well. You get to start right where you are and begin applying these spiritual principles to your priorities. And through applying the principles and demonstrating to yourself, what you have is the opportunity to find out who you are through how powerful you are. Because science of mind is not about accepting limitations. Science of mind is not about giving up your priorities. Science of mind is about making your dreams come true. But this morning is not about how to use these principles to heal disease, to heal problems, and you certainly can do that. This morning I want to talk to you about the mystical heritage of science of mind. Now, this is a real abbreviated sort of history. So allow me that kind of leeway. As I have studied over the years, I always gravitated to the studies, the principles that had to do with consciousness creating reality. As ye believe, so shall it be done unto you. Whatever you ask for in prayer, believing you shall have it, you shall have it. Because that's what I needed. When I was studying, when I was sick, I didn't want to learn how to live within my human limitations. I didn't want to learn how to live with my physical limitations. What I wanted to learn was how do I use these principles that have been talked about throughout history to create the reality that I want. And it didn't start off so I could be well. I started applying these principles so I wouldn't cry myself to sleep every night. I started applying these principles so I wouldn't be so depressed. And what I began to discover was that there was this idea of truth and power that runs throughout the mystical teachings. If I go back, the oldest living religion that's out there today is the Hindu faith. When I first started studying the Hindu scriptures and what they talked about, it was real confusing. I loved the Hindu philosophy because it starts with the idea that everybody is different. That's one of their primary focal points in the beginning. Everybody's different. And out of that difference, it seemed that at first that there was a God for everything. They got thousands of gods. But as I continued to study, what I began to understand was these various aspects, these various individualized gods were just various aspects of the one divine presence they talked about. Because the Hindus start with everybody's different, if you're a farmer, they got a god you can get a little statue of this god, and that god's sole purpose is to help farmers grow crops. So if you were a Hindu, you could go to your local bookstore, like we have here, and get a statue of this little god and put it up on your mantle, and you could know that your God was there to help you grow your crops. If you were a woman and you were moving into having a family, they got a goddess, a representation of the divine essence that's just to help women have children. And so as I began to study the Hindu faith, I began to see that, what I love about them is they come from everybody's different, and they talk about their God, if you will, in a way that allows you to relate to it based on your priorities. But then if you move up through the Hindu teachings and start to move into the mystical teachings of Hinduism, and there's lots of books about that, but one of the ones I loved was The Magic and Mysticism of India. And on page 39, the author says this. He says, and this was written in the 1920s, in the Hindu teachings, it is held that there exists a universal mental principle which is known as creative mind. Sound familiar? The essence of this creative mind can be described as something like the blending or combination of one's personal will and their imagination. And that each individual is possessed with a portion of this, what they're calling creative mind. And that people have the right to use this mind based on their priorities. And then in summary of that chapter, the author says, in other words, the Hindu teachings hold that the mind, when advanced enough, has the power of materializing physical creation directly itself without the need for physical activity. That the mind, when developed enough, has the ability to create material representations without doing anything other than just speaking your word into the law, if you will. Pick up your bed and walk. Be ye cleansed. You have a picnic and you run out of food, you just bring the loaves and fishes together, do a little woo-woo stuff, and bang, you got enough food to feed 5,000. That the power of the mind could be used when developed enough to create miracles, if you will. That's the Hindu teachings. But you couldn't get in and study that stuff unless you were born in the right caste system. Of course, you had to be male. You had to do all the other things and know the right secret handshake and the secret password so you could get into the room where they finally studied that stuff. Only a select few were exposed to the idea of the power of consciousness. Later, as you move through the sort of the history of science of mind, the next ones to come in the living religions is the Jewish faith. The Jewish faith was started by a guy named Abraham, or Abram, depending on how you want to pronounce it. He lived in a culture where there were many gods, not like the Hindu where there's many gods referring to the one. He lived in a culture where there were thousands of gods. And one day he just decided, no, there's not thousands of gods, there's only one God. One God does everything. Monotheistic, they called it. And out of his this revelation came the teachings that we refer to as Judaism. As Judaism evolved, up came the mystical teachings within Judaism, and that's usually held to be condensed into what we call the Kabbalah, the mystical teachings of Judaism. The Kabbalah is about, remember, this is a real loose translation, it's my summary. The Kabbalah is about how to use some spiritual principles to heal the separation that happened when mankind, humankind, left being one with God and came into form. And when that happened, there was a rift. It's that original sin thing, that we were one with God, and then we came into human form, and now we're not. And so the whole Kabbalah, their focus is to use mystical intention in prayer, is what they call it. It's called Kovana, K-O-V-A-N-A-H. How to use mystical intention in prayer to heal this apparent separation between your spirit and God. But you could only use these principles for certain things. Same with the Hindu faith. Once you got up to study that stuff, you could only use these principles for the rules, for the highest and best good of everybody concerned. You couldn't use it for what you want. You have to use it for the high, they had all these rules. The same within the Jewish faith. There were all these rules where you could use it, and you could only use these principles on your spiritual needs. And then along comes a guy named Isaac Luria. Isaac Luria is credited as, I know this is kind of dry, but it gets to a really good point, so hang in there with me. Isaac Luria is credited as being one of the three most influential teachers in the history of the Kabbalah. And when it gets to Luria's teachings, this is out of the Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, it says, but the doctrine of mystical intention in prayer does not stop there for Luria. For he took the whole school of thought in classical Kabbalism and he merely developed it further. And Luria's doctrine of mystical intention in prayer stands directly on the borderline between traditional mysticism and magic. Now, when they use the word magic, they're not talking sleight of hand. In the old days, you could use the power of the mind on your spiritual needs, and it was called one thing. But when you use the power of the mind, consciousness, on your human needs, your human aspirations, and you could produce miracles, that was called magic. So that's how they used the term then. Now, when Luria's doctrine came out where he said, no, you can use these principles on your priorities, your aspirations, there was this big brouhaha. Oh, no, you can't. That's your ego talking. Well, they probably didn't use that yet. Ego wasn't the make wrong thing it is today. Anyway, so, oh, no, you can't use it on this. You can only use it on your spiritual needs. And Luria said, no, you can use it on your human needs. These spiritual principles are not just about your spiritual nature. It's about your human nature. And there was this big brouhaha. About that time, that within the Jewish tradition, as it's moving up, along comes what's called the ancient mystery schools. The Druids in the United Kingdom area, the Essenes in the Middle East, the School of Isis for women in Egypt, the Magi in Persia. Like today, there were many paths to God. And these different mystery schools taught different things. The Essenes taught a lot about meditation and contemplation and ritual. The Magi taught how to use mind to create form. And that's why they were called the Magi, because it comes from magic. So the Magi was all about how to use consciousness to create form. About this time, 2,500 years ago, there was this discussion between the leaders of these various organizations, because it is said in the mystical writings that the leaders all knew they were one. The leaders knew there were just many paths to one God. And it is said about 100 years ago, 3,000 years ago, these leaders got together and said, it's time we take these secret teachings, because even in the Kabbalah, you couldn't go study it unless you were a woman. You couldn't get into the classes that's taught about the Kabbalah unless you could prove that for 5 generations on both sides of your parentage that they were Jewish. In other words, there were these rules you had to fit into. You had to know the right handshake. You had to know the right people. And these leaders came together and said, it's time we take these secret teachings to the world. And supposedly a call went out to an ascended master who would be willing to come again to take these secret teachings to the world. And there is an inference this great master was born about 2,000 years ago, and his name was Jesus. I'm not saying this is the way it is. I'm not saying here is the truth and, all that stuff. I'm talking about if you go explore the mystical teachings throughout history, there is this thread of truth that moves along until this great teacher, Jesus, came 2,000 years ago. In the original Greek writings of the Old Testament, the original Greek, well, it's really written in Hebrew. The guys, in the original Greek of the New Testament, the guys that come to visit Jesus at his birth are not called the 3 wise men. In the original Greek, they're called the masters of Magi. And it is said that those masters of Magi came from different parts of Persia for one purpose: to acknowledge, to symbolically acknowledge that Jesus was the one to take these secret teachings to the world. There was a book written in 1200 A.D. by a Hebrew scholar named Moses Van Malman. His book is called The Guide for the Perplexed. It sounds like a text we might be able to use today. But in that book, he says that in the scripture, in the Hebrew writings, where it says that they came together and said, let us make man in our image, what he says is that when that was written, people took that to mean that God looks like us. God has a face, God had hands, God has personality, God has love, God has anger, God is judgmental, God's not judgmental. And he says, because they misinterpreted that, they made God in our image. And he says in his book that he goes on to explain that the phrase, let us make man in our image, signifies not a physical likeness, but an intellectual likeness. If you go and study the mystical teachings throughout history, there is a thread of truth that leads us to what we teach in Science of Mind. Ernest Holmes says boldly, the mind of God is my mind. That's what he's talking about. You and I stand on a threshold where very few people have been before. And that threshold is that you and I have the opportunity not only to study, but to practice these ancient disciplines about how to take charge of your creative mind. Ernest Holmes, in his book, Living the Science of Mind, on page 72, says the whole purpose of science of mind, the whole purpose of metaphysics, not just science of mind. He's talking about unity, divine science, all of them. The whole purpose of metaphysics is to prove the teachings of Jesus. Not was he the only son of God, and was it a virgin birth, and all that kind of stuff. The teachings of Jesus. And then he goes on and he says, it's interesting to note, while all the great scriptures essentially agree about our relationship to the divine, in other words, there's one divine presence, we're all part of that and all that. He says it's interesting to note that other than the Christian scriptures, very little is mentioned in the other great spiritual traditions about healing the sick or controlling conditions through the power of your mind. I submit to you that what Jesus brought to the party was the idea that you can take charge of your creative consciousness and make your dreams come true. And through making your dreams come true, what you get is an experience of who you are that's even bigger than your dreams. This is what Ernest is talking about when he says you can only know as much as you can demonstrate. In other words, just knowing the theory isn't enough. He calls us time and time again to demonstrate that theory in your lives based on your priorities. Jesus said it, faith without works is dead. What do you want to do with your life? What do you want to create with your life? Certainly there are many different paths to understanding your divinity. You need to understand that they are just that. They are different paths. Letting go of your personal priorities is not the same as taking charge of your creative mind and making your dreams come true. Giving up your attachment to the outcome is not the same as being absolutely focused and never taking no for an answer. One of the challenges is you and I read so many books. We read a little of this and a little of this and a little of this and a little of this. And what Ernest says is, while he says that's wonderful, he says what happens is we get the introduction of contradictory ideas, and what happens is we're not sure what to do anymore, so we let go and let God. Let me tell you something. If you know what you want and you're on track to get it and you're using these principles every day, you don't have time to let go and let God. You're too busy creating reality. You have an opportunity to make your dreams come true. It's hard to put into words because the words that men developed thousands of years ago weren't developed, so you and I could talk about being God in form. But that's what we need to move to. Ernest Holmes says the most important word today in spirituality is the word as. Because we need to move away from God and me. And we need to step up to God as me. God as woman. God as man. That's the truth that sets you free. That you're holy. That's what the foundation of science of mind. First two steps of treatment. There's one divine presence in the universe. I call that God. You can call it whatever you want. You've felt it. You've seen it in the smile of a child. You've seen it in the beauty of a flower. There's one divine presence. God. And the next step is that divine presence and I are one. There's nothing for me to do to become one with that. That is the truth. I don't have to forgive enough. I don't have to let go enough. I'm already holy. And from that truth, you step into human existence, free. And what are you free from? The lie of human limitations. Jesus didn't say all things are possible if you believe they are. Oh, but you can't do this, and you can't do this, and you need to give up this, and you need to give up this. He didn't say, whatever you ask for in prayer, believing you shall have it, you shall have it. Oh, except that you can't do this, and you can't do this, and you can't do this. We did that. This philosophy is about your priorities. Do you realize how blessed you are to be part of a community whose sole purpose is to assist you to find the truth that sets you free? That's the whole purpose of this community. You take a look at the things in your what's coming up, your Wednesday night services, the support groups for men. You've got it used to be a bereavement thing, but now it's just a challenge thing to come together with like-minded people to be supported in your vision. Do you have any idea how many nights I prayed just to have somebody look me in the eye and say, if you can't know this truth for you, understand that I can know it for you until you step up. That's what these 1-minute miracles are about. To sit with one of your peers who've been trained and say, this is what's going on, and have this intelligent, capable person say, I am with you, and so is the power of God. What you've created here in this center is not just life-changing for us. It's life-changing for the planet. Use these principles on something that's important to you. And when it happens, you get feedback through your human senses based on your own personal priorities that, well, I made a difference. And that schwank comes up. Use the principles on that. That's what Jesus was talking about when he said pray unceasingly. I don't think it was like this, pray unceasingly. It was like use these principles. Ernest Holmes says treatment is not something you do in the morning, it's something you do at night. Treatment is how you live your life. You move into your life from my God, expressing uniquely as me, and then when something happens, you speak your word into it. Next want comes up. Use the principles on that. You'll get feedback against this. Whoa! It happened again. Isn't this great? You know, next want comes up. Use the principles on that. And that when that happens, it's like, wow, it happened again. And after about 3 or 4 in a row, there's a shift in the mind. And the shift is sort of like, I'm on a hot streak. or all things are working together for good in my life. And I don't mean this as an affirmation when your life's going down the toilet. You get feedback about your power. And if you continue to use these principles, what you move into is what I call the state of grace. Now you got to be careful with the state of grace, because a lot of people who wrote books about it say you need to leave your priorities at the door. You need to leave your aspirations at the door. Jesus never said that, and neither did Ernest Holmes. When I walked into my first Science of Mind church almost 40 years ago, I picked up a pamphlet. I didn't know what it was about. And it said, Science of Mind is the correlation of the laws of science, the opinions of philosophy, and the revelations of religion applied to human needs and the aspirations of humanity. And I was still sick. And I looked right there and it said, this church is about my priorities. This church is about supporting me and my ability to create health, even though everybody else had given up. How in these few moments do I reach inside your heart and your mind and tell you about the glory that awaits you? It's not just about being positive when life is going to hell in a handbasket. These principles are about finally being able to stand in front of a mirror and look at a body that's pain-free. These principles are about standing in front of a mirror and experiencing the wonder of the healing ability of the human body. What are your dreams? What are your priorities? Remember, I started just so I wouldn't cry myself to sleep. And through the practice of these principles, I began to know not only is it possible for me to get well, it's probable that I'm going to get well. All of these disciplines, all of them, when you move up to the top, they have what I call DDSP, daily disciplined spiritual practices. All of them. And they're all different. Read 15 different Hindu texts about what they teach at the high levels of mysticism, and they'll have 15 different things you're supposed to do. Go into the Jewish faith and read in the Kabbalah, and they have different things you're supposed to do. What I have found in my involvement in Science of Mind for almost 40 years is even great teachers who we have known each other for years, you may approach it a little different than me. The words that hit you in your soul that you use in a treatment may not be the exact words I do. But we stand together boldly in supporting each other to learn how to do it for yourself. This discipline called Science of Mind is about you mastering the principles. And it's not near as difficult as people want you to believe. It just comes down to what Ernest says. Daily, we must consciously choose our position in the law. Daily, we must consciously choose our position in the law. I don't know what your dreams are. I don't know what your priorities are. What I absolutely know is that you are more magnificent than you ever imagined, and you have more power than you might think. And so from the bottom of my heart, as I stand before you, honored to be in your presence, I would leave you with one thought. Get involved in this center. Get involved in this center. Get involved in this center.